7 o'clock in the morning. Not quite light outside yet. Inside a quiet house on a quiet street in Nailsea, a phone begins to dial. The fingers pressing the numbers are small. One set belongs to a 6-year-old. The other, standing close behind, belongs to his 3-year-old brother. They are not calling their mother, they are calling about her. On the other end of the line, an operator hears 2 young voices trying to explain something that no child should ever have to put into words. Something is wrong with Mummy. She will not wake up. Within minutes, blue lights are turning into that street. What the officers find inside that house will end one life, destroy another, and leave 2 small boys carrying a memory they never asked for. This is the case of Claire Tavener, a young wife and mother, and a husband who was not the man everyone around them believed him to be. Now, if this is your first time here, I'm really glad you found this channel. Every day I dive deep into real criminal cases, breaking them down piece by piece so we can actually understand what happened and why. If that sounds like something you'd be into, go ahead and hit subscribe. It's free and it means a lot. Okay, now let's get back to the case. Claire Tavener was 27 years old. She was born and raised in Somerset, the daughter of Steve and Sarah Wilmot, and by every account from the people who knew her, she was a girl who loved life without complication. Her father remembered her as a happy, outgoing child, the sort who was drawn to animals long before she was drawn to anything else. She had a particular fondness for horses growing up, and those who knew her as a girl described someone who was never one to give up on anything she set her mind to. That determination followed her into adulthood. By the time she was in her 20s, Claire was working part-time behind the bar at the Old Farmhouse, a local pub in Nailsea. Regulars there knew her as friendly, easy to talk to, the kind of person who made an ordinary evening at the pub feel a little warmer. But by January 2018, Claire's world had narrowed down to something far more important than any job. She was a mother. She and her husband Andrew had 2 young sons together, Rory, 6 years old, and Blake, just 3. Neighbours who lived near the family's home on Brendan Gardens, where the Taveners had moved only around 7 months earlier, remembered them simply as a nice couple with 2 sweet young boys. Good morning, good afternoon. The small exchanges of people who live an ordinary life next door to you. Those who were close to Claire say her boys were the centre of everything for her. She is remembered as a mother who adored her sons completely, who built her days around them, who saw her future through them. That is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is the boys we will return to later in this story. Life for Claire in early January 2018 would have looked, from the outside, entirely unremarkable. Shifts behind the bar, school runs, the everyday rhythm of raising a 6-year-old and a 3-year-old at the same time. Neighbours on Brendan Gardens saw a young mother who was, by every appearance, simply getting on with her life, the way any mother of 2 small boys does. There is something particularly painful about the ordinariness of that final stretch of her life. There was no dramatic goodbye, no sense that anything was about to change forever. Just a mother, working a part-time job she seemed to enjoy, coming home to 2 boys who adored her, in a house she had lived in for less than a year. Right now, in January 2018, Claire Tavener was a young mother juggling a part-time job, 2 small children, and a marriage that behind the front door of an ordinary-looking house was quietly falling apart. She had no idea how little time she had left. Andrew Tavener was 45 years old, 18 years older than his wife. He worked as a tree surgeon, a physical, outdoor trade, and to the neighbours who occasionally passed him on the street, there was nothing about him that stood out. He was simply the husband, half of a nice young couple with two sweet boys. That is often how these cases begin. Not with a monster who announces himself, but with a man who blends completely into the background of an ordinary residential street. Claire and Andrew had built a life together, a marriage, 2 children, a home. From the outside, by the accounts of those who lived nearby, there was nothing to suggest the household was anything other than settled. But those closest to the couple told a different story once the case came to court. People who knew them well later said that alcohol was a recurring problem in the relationship, something that repeatedly caused friction between Andrew and Claire. Drink did not simply make evenings difficult. It appears, based on what was later heard in court, to have shifted the entire temperature of the household. And this was not the first time concern had been raised. Court records show that as early as February 2015, 3 years before her death, Claire had reported 2 separate incidents of violence to the police. 2 reports, made years in advance, sitting quietly in a file somewhere while the couple continued their lives, married, had children, and moved house. We are not told here to shock you with that detail. We are told it so that later, when we discuss the verdict and the system around it, you understand this was not a marriage where the danger was invisible. It had already been named once, years before anyone thought it would end the way it did. By January 2018, that underlying tension had not gone away. It had simply been living quietly under the surface of a family that, to everyone outside it, looked entirely unremarkable. To understand what happened on the night of the 7th of January 2018, you need to understand what was happening to the marriage in the weeks before it. By this point, the relationship between Andrew and Claire was breaking down. According to the case later presented in court, the marriage was in the process of ending. Whether that meant a formal separation was being discussed, or simply that the emotional distance between them had become unmistakable, the prosecution's account was clear on one point. The collapse of the relationship sat at the very center of what happened next, and alongside that collapse came suspicion. The case put before the court described Andrew acting in what was characterized as a jealous rage, driven by a belief that Claire was having an affair. Whether or not that belief had any basis in fact, it became, in Andrew's mind, the lens through which he viewed his wife's actions in the final days of her life. This is a pattern that appears again and again in cases involving intimate partner violence. A relationship reaches its ending point, and instead of that ending being accepted, it becomes something the more controlling partner refuses to allow. The fear of losing control over a partner, of a marriage slipping away entirely, has been documented time and again as one of the most dangerous points in an abusive relationship. Not the middle of it, but the moment it appears to be ending. Layered on top of that was the drinking. Alcohol had already been identified as a source of conflict throughout the marriage, and it does not create new problems so much as it strips away whatever control a person still has over the ones that already exist. A man already struggling with jealousy and the loss of his marriage, already known to drink heavily, was now facing what he believed was the final unraveling of his family. There was no single dramatic warning sign in the days before the 7th of January that jumped out to those around the couple. No one on Brendan Gardens has described anything unusual in that final week. That too is a pattern worth noting. Escalation inside a home is rarely visible to the street outside it. This is one of the hardest aspects of cases like this one for outsiders to grasp. Neighbors continue to see a nice couple. Colleagues continue to see a reliable tradesman and a friendly barmaid. Life on the surface carries on looking exactly as it did the week before, and the week before that, while underneath it, something is quietly reaching a breaking point. It is only afterwards, once a case like this reaches a courtroom, that the pattern becomes visible at all, pieced together from statements, records, and the accounts of those who knew the couple best. By the night of Sunday the 7th of January 2018, all of these pressures, the failing marriage, the suspicion of infidelity, the drinking, the years of underlying tension, were sitting inside one house, with two young children asleep down the hall. Sometime between the evening of Sunday the 7th of January and the early hours of Monday the 8th of January 2018, inside the family home on Brendan Gardens in Nailsea, Andrew Tavener attacked his wife. Claire was stabbed 10 times. The wounds included 2 to her neck, along with injuries to her arms and hands, consistent with her attempting to defend herself. The attack has since been described by prosecutors as sustained and deliberate, not a single impulsive strike, but a prolonged assault. Claire did not survive. In the house that night were her 2 sons, Rory, 6, and Blake, 3. Shortly before 7 o'clock on the morning of Monday the 8th of January, the boys found their mother. What exactly they understood in that moment, no outside account can fully capture. But what we do know is that the elder of the 2 boys, 6-year-old Rory, made the call. He dialed 999 and told the operator he believed his mother was dead. By the time police arrived at the house, Andrew Tavener was no longer there. He had left the scene and made his way to Nailsea and Backwell railway station. There, in what has been reported as an attempt to end his own life, he lay down in front of an oncoming train. He survived, but suffered severe injuries to his left hand, ultimately losing several fingers. When officers reached him on the platform, injured and in obvious distress, Andrew admitted to what he had done. He told them plainly that he had killed his wife, and that there was no uncertainty about it. He was taken into hospital, where he remained for several weeks, receiving treatment for his injuries. It was only once he was well enough that detectives were able to formally interview him. He was charged with murder on the 1st of February 2018, just over 3 weeks after Claire's death. The immediate aftermath left a family shattered in every direction. A mother was dead, a father was in custody, and 2 young boys, who should have been starting a new school term that January, were instead the ones who had found her. News of what had happened moved quickly through Nailsea. Neighbours who had exchanged nothing more than passing greetings with the family were now facing the reality that the quiet house on Brendan Gardens had been the scene of a killing. For a small town, the shock was immediate. For the wider community, it raised the same question that so often follows cases like this one. How does something like this happen behind a front door that looked no different from any other on the street? In a case like this, where the person responsible confesses at the scene, the forensic and physical evidence is not primarily about identifying who committed the crime. Andrew Tavener never denied that he killed Claire. Instead, this evidence becomes central to establishing exactly how the attack unfolded and to proving the level of intent behind it, which is precisely what separates a murder charge from a lesser one. The post-mortem findings were central here. Claire had sustained 10 stab wounds. Court records specify that 2 of these were to her neck, an area of the body where an attack is far more likely to prove fatal, and where the positioning of wounds can speak to how close and how direct the assault was. Just as significant were the defensive injuries recorded on her arms and hands. In forensic pathology, these wounds tell their own story. They indicate that Claire was conscious and attempting to protect herself during at least part of the attack, which supports the prosecution's description of a sustained assault rather than a single, sudden act. Taken together, the number of wounds, their location, and the presence of defensive injuries allowed prosecutors to argue that this was not a single moment of loss of control, but a deliberate and continued assault. That distinction matters enormously in English law. It speaks directly to intent, and intent is what elevates a killing from manslaughter to murder. There was also physical evidence tied to Andrew himself. His severe hand injuries, sustained after he placed himself in front of a train, were consistent with a person attempting to take his own life following an act of extreme violence, a pattern investigators have observed in other cases of intimate partner homicide, where the perpetrator's next act is directed at themselves. Finally, there was his own account at the scene. His words to police on the platform, effectively an immediate and unprompted admission, removed any question of identity from the case entirely. Combined with the physical evidence from the scene itself, it left the court with a case that was less about who and entirely about what happened and why. Ultimately, Andrew Tavener pleaded guilty to murder. The forensic picture, the pattern of wounds, the defensive injuries, and his own words at the railway station made that outcome effectively unavoidable. Before going further, it is worth saying clearly, nothing here is intended as a clinical diagnosis of Andrew Tavener. He was never presented in court as suffering from a diagnosed mental illness that explained his actions. What follows is an analysis based only on the patterns of behavior that were reported, set against what research into domestic homicide has taught us more broadly. At the center of this case sits one of the most consistent and most dangerous patterns identified in intimate partner violence: the perceived loss of control over a partner. The prosecution's account placed the breakdown of the marriage and Andrew's belief that Claire was involved with someone else at the heart of his motive. Criminologists who study domestic homicide describe this exact combination repeatedly. It is not simply jealousy in the abstract. It is jealousy tied to the fear of abandonment, the sense that a partner who is leaving is a partner who can no longer be controlled. Alcohol compounded this. It did not create the underlying tension in the marriage that had already been documented years earlier, but it is widely understood to reduce inhibition and impulse control at precisely the moments when they matter most. A man already prone to jealousy, already known to become difficult when drinking, facing what he believed was the end of his marriage, represents a combination that domestic violence researchers consistently flag as high risk. Then there is the history. Claire's reports to police in February 2015 are significant here, not as evidence of what Andrew would eventually do, but as a documented marker that concerning behavior existed inside this relationship long before January 2018. Research into domestic homicide repeatedly shows that prior reports of violence, even when they do not result in prosecution, remain one of the strongest known risk indicators for future serious harm. Finally, his actions after the attack deserve attention. Fleeing the scene and then attempting to take his own life at the railway station is a pattern that has been observed in other cases of men who kill a partner. It has been interpreted by some researchers as a form of extreme guilt or collapse once the violence is complete. Others caution against reading it as remorse alone, noting that it can also reflect an unwillingness to face the consequences of what has just happened, rather than genuine regret for the person who is now dead. What the evidence in this case does support is a portrait of controlling, jealousy-driven behavior present for years, escalating under the pressure of a marriage ending, and finally erupting with fatal consequences on one night in January. It is also worth noting what this case does not show. There is no suggestion in the reporting of a long, premeditated plan, no evidence of a weapon bought in advance or a scheme laid out over weeks. What the record instead points to is something researchers describe as reactive violence rooted in control, a sudden and extreme escalation triggered by the perceived loss of a relationship, rather than a calculated act planned from a distance. That distinction does not make the outcome any less final for Claire, but it does help explain why cases like this one are so difficult to predict, even when warning signs, like the reports from 2015, already exist on record. Here is the part of this case that most retellings pass over quickly, and it is the part worth sitting with the longest. This was not a marriage where danger appeared out of nowhere. 3 years before Claire Tavener was killed, in February 2015, she went to the police. Twice. She reported incidents of violence involving the man she would go on to marry. That detail changes how this case should be understood. This was not simply a sudden, unforeseeable tragedy. It was a documented risk that existed on paper, in a police file, years before it became fatal. And yet the relationship continued. The couple married, they had 2 children, they moved into a new home together 7 months before Claire's death. And to every neighbor who greeted them on the street, they looked like a nice young family. This is not a story about a single missed opportunity. It is a story about how easily an early warning sign, once it has been reported, once it exists officially on record, can still be absorbed back into ordinary life. A report is made, time passes, the relationship appears to stabilize, at least from the outside, and the file that documented the danger sits quietly, unconnected to anything, until it is retrieved after the fact, as evidence in a murder trial rather than as a warning that was ever acted upon in time. This is why cases like Claire's matter beyond the individual tragedy. They raise a question that domestic abuse charities and campaigners have pushed for years. How many reports of violence, made by women who are trying to protect themselves, end up filed away rather than followed through, only to resurface later as court exhibits after it is already too late? There is no suggestion here that anyone acted with bad intent, or that Claire's case was handled with any less care than any other. But the timeline itself, a report in 2015, a marriage that continued, and a death in 2018, is the uncomfortable thread that runs underneath this entire case. It is the question this story leaves you with, long after the verdict has been read. At Bristol Crown Court, on the 10th of April 2018, Andrew Tavener was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 16 years and 8 months to serve before he can even be considered for release. The judge, Peter Blair, described his conduct as utterly self-centered, unspeakably cruel, and appallingly traumatic for the children involved. It is difficult to disagree with that assessment. Claire's family released a statement after the sentencing. They spoke of a young woman who was loved for her love of life and her positive outlook, and they said, simply, that their lives would never be the same, that nothing could bring their daughter back. It is worth returning for a moment to where this story began. 2 small boys, dialing a phone before 7 in the morning, trying to explain something no child should ever have to explain. That call was made by Rory, just 6 years old, with his 3-year-old brother Blake standing beside him. They did not simply lose their mother that night. They became the ones who found her, and the ones who had to ask for help when no adult in that house could. Claire Tavener was 27, a daughter who loved horses as a girl, a barmaid who made regulars feel welcome at the end of their day, and, above everything else, a mother who idolized her 2 sons completely. That is who she was before any of this happened, and it is who she deserves to be remembered as. If you want to understand how investigators piece together a case like this one, from a first responder's call to a guilty plea in Crown Court, that is exactly what this channel is for. Every day, we break these cases down properly, without the noise, so hit subscribe if that is something you want more of. Thank you for watching.